Achuapa. He served as, after the triumph of the revolution, he served as the Nicaraguan ambassador to the United Nations, and in that capacity participated in the Contadora negotiations and various other negotiations. Then he became, after 1990, a member and the political secretary of the Dirección Nacional of the FESLN. In 2005, he was expelled. He was expelled from the FESLN together with Erte Lewites for having presented a democratic challenge within the party. He served subsequently as a member of Congress for the Movimiento Renovador Sandinista, the MRSA, and is currently a member of the governing directorate of the Movimiento Renovador Sandinista. So basically we have two leaders of two different opposition groups, the Sandinista opposition to the Ortega or Sandinista, however you prefer to call it, government, and then the Alianza Blanco y Azul. Okay? So I'd like to invite Donald first to come to the podium, and they'll each get 20 minutes. I've got my yellow and red cards to keep us on time.
Good afternoon. First off, I would like to thank the Watson Institute and Professor Stephen Kinzer, Stephen Bloomfield, Richard Snyder, and Mateo Joaquim for their invitation. This conference brings together different protagonists of the Nicaraguan conflict that had to settle on opposite sides, even though now many of us are in the same side. Obviously, their differences will emerge in the debate, but their experiences are important inputs to understand the tragedy of war. I'm going to skip some arguments that I have written before because they've been said, but I want to touch on 5 points. First, an introduction on the emergence of La Contra, necessary for the next topic about the human factor of the Nicaraguan resistance, which will allow us to understand the internal conflicts that made it impossible to turn a low-intensity war into a national liberation war. Thirdly, I want to reflect on the stagnation of the war after almost 8 years of fighting and the option of peace with the Treaty of Esquipulas and the Zapoa agreements, which led to the disarticulation of the La Contra army. What did we learn from that terrible and heroic experience of the resistance? It is something that I'll comment on in the fourth point of my lecture. From July of 1979 and much of 1980, some small armed groups of the extinct National Guard of Anastasio Somoza dictatorship survived amid widespread hostility. They were bands that prowled through towns and villages without any direction and any slogan. Towards the end of 1980 and the beginning of 1981, the ex-guards were joined by members of the Milpas, the popular anti-Somoza militias. They were peasants with rudimentary weapons who had taken part in the insurrection against Somoza and who now fled and confronted the new government that, with the luxury of violence, tried to impose rules foreign to their customs and traditions. I'm not going to analyze it because it is sufficiently clear. The role of Cubans from the first moment of the Sandinista revolution. Their presence and influence was decisive to intervene in all aspects of national life and to consolidate in Nicaragua what many called and denounce timidly as a second Cuba. Defense, security, international relations, economy, education, including the literacy and agrarian reform campaigns, were part of a strategic and ideological offensive of Cubans with their Nicaraguan allies. Many citizens began to notice that the initial effort of an entire people to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship was leading to the establishment of a new dictatorship. To understand the evolution and contradictions of the resistance, we must analyze it in parts, and I'm going to summarize. The Nicaraguan Democratic Force, the FDN, was created by the CIA, and it wasn't born as an army of national liberation. The CIA privileged the support to former officers of the extinct National Guard, whom it put at the head of the project without considering the repressive and criminal background of many of them, which in turn led to serious violations of the laws of war and human rights. Over time, a part of the former guards, who were command and task leaders, left for various reasons from the theater of war and were replaced by those who they called disparagingly civilians. They were peasant fighters who had excelled in the fighting. The Revolutionary Democratic Alliance, ARDE, another part of the Contra, was formed in September 1982 with dissidents of the revolution led by Commander Eden Pastora and Alfonso Robelo. The underlying idea, which could of what could legitimize the Sandinista fight, but it was easily penetrated by the secret agents of the Sandinistas, and in the midst of war, all of their military and political structure was revealed publicly by a spy of the Sandinista front that had been Eden Pastora's lover. The Atlantic Front of the Mosquito Indians arose for the same reasons as the peasant resistance to the expropriation of common lands and the prohibition of artisanal activities of gold washers known as guiriceros. They added compulsory programs to Sandinize the Atlantic region. In 1980, the first protest took place in Bluefield, accompanied as usual by a strong repression and extrajudicial executions in San Carlos and Lemus. By 1982, the government evicted 8,000 Misquitos living near the border with Honduras and placed them in resettlement camps near Puerto Cabezas. Thousands of indigenous people fled to Honduras to the point that in 1984 there were 15,477 Misquitos registered in the UN refugee camps on the northern border, and in 1986 the number had increased to more than 35,000. Other thousands of refugees arrived at the border with Costa Rica. A third of the indigenous population, just over 130,000 people, had emigrated. The indigenous organizations, product of their culture and ethnic organization, were also born divided. Misura with Sedman Fagot and Misura Sata with Brooklyn Rivera were integrated with thousands of men in the north and southern fronts of the Contras. The problems and divisions of the political leadership were permanent among its leaders until in July of 1987 all the factions became Yatama. The National Opposition Union was born in 1985 to improve the image of the Contras before the Congress of the United States. The Interagency Committee was headed by Arturo Cruz, a former member of the Sandinista Government Board, Alfonso Robero, and Adolfo Calero, who handled the funds of the FDN in his position as Commander-in-Chief of the armed organization. The Southern Opposition Bloc was formed in July 1985, with much of what was left of ARDE, or the ARDE, including Eden Pastor as one of the secondary leaders. In 1987, after negotiations with the political sector of the UNO and the main military leaders of the FDN, the Nicaraguan resistance was founded. With the creation of the Nicaraguan resistance, insurmountable differences emerged among the FDN, the UNO, and the BOS, not only within the organizations themselves, but also with the North American project managers, the Interagency Committee of the Resistance Project. There's a very simple generalization that leads to wrong ideas of how the groups worked, or this interagency committee in charge of Nicaragua, how it worked with regards to the war in Nicaragua. There was a division of work. The Department of State had the political part of it under their charge. The National Security Council and the CIA had the military under their charge. And these were two completely different worlds with no connection to each other. And that's where the first divergence came about. A division of the work between uh, the political and military aspects without a common plan and a common vision of what they were doing. They had general ideas and they had general intentions too to end Sandinismo, but there wasn't a unique project among them, and each agency gave priority to what they thought was important. And here there was a second fork. Each one of the officials in charge tried to give their personal uh, seal to the contra. Oliver North had his own vision of the problem, and he acted based on that the whole time he was there. Adrian Abrams had another vision, and the CIA, through various representatives, also had another vision. And how was this manifested? It was manifested in differences with the Nicaraguans. For example, there were operations that the CIA executed and the Contras didn't have any idea about, like the mining of the ports. There were Contra military operations that were not authorized by the logistics officer. There were military positions contrary to the political interest of the war. So, since the beginning, you had these different difficulties. For many, the Contras were mercenaries at the service of the Reagan administration, and they received money to upkeep the insurgents and that obeyed Washington. But the truth of the facts was not so simple. The Contra was a massive social movement that included former guards, peasants, dissident Sandinistas, students, professionals, businessmen, traditional politicians, and intellectuals. But there was also a minority of other people, adventurers, opportunists, thugs, and infiltrated agents in the service of other interests. By its own heterogeneous nature, the diversity of sectors integrated in the resistance produced logically a variety of political and ideological projects with opposing strategic objectives and approaches that also clashed with the strategies of the US promoters. A large part of the proposals of the UNO and the BOS aimed at giving priority to the political character of the war were summarized in two publications edited in Miami: Foro Centroamericano, a biweekly newspaper, and Resistencia, a monthly magazine. The FDN brought together the most conservative sectors of La Contra on the North Front, but they did not constitute a homogeneous political bloc, as their most renowned political and military leaders defended positions ranging from a civilized right to a primitive right. ARDE was born and kept until its demise a revolutionary democratic project. The greatest legitimacy of that civil war against the Sandinista government lies, without a doubt, in the peasantry and indigenous people of the Mosquito Coast. They successfully resisted the largest army in the history of Central America, composed of hundreds of thousands of men, but they could not transcend because of the short-sightedness of their leaders and the incapacity of their North American allies and promoters. The Contra was much more successful militarily than people are willing to admit. The problem is that this victory in the military field did not translate into any political victory that was legitimized or recognized. If the former National Guards in charge of the military leadership, of the imposed military leadership, had prioritized the waging of the war, the strategic planning, and the search for resources parallel to those of the United States, the legitimacy and democratic nature of the struggle would have been unquestionable. For that, it was essential to define the nature of the resistance as an indivisible military political project and not as two antagonistic things. The first participation of the U.S. against the Sandinistas happened on November 16, 1981, when the first order by President Reagan was signed to authorize the CIA to carry out covert actions to cut the support of the Sandinistas to the Salvadorian guerrilla. From July of 1979 to November 1981, 28 months went by without any aggression from the Reagan administration to the Sandinista government. 28 months where there was no war, no intervention, no money from the Contra or the CIA. But that war that the Americans promoted at the beginning and designed at the beginning transformed, even without them, in something completely different because of the peasants that got tired, and the Americans were not mentally or legally prepared for that metamorphosis. And I want to be specific on this. They could not remove a foreign government like the Sandinista government. That goal was never established. It was the contrary. There are words by Abrams that say that the objective was not to remove the Sandinista government because besides it being illegal, the eyes of Congress were on them and being processed for going against the law in the U.S. meant the end of a bureaucratic career of the members of the Interagency Commission. For 1988, by 1998, there was a critical tie in the military actions, joined by due to the Soviet Union that decided the Sandinistas to finish the war. But these negotiations were asymmetrical since the beginning. The Contra that had showed goodwill to negotiate an agreement to reach peace and democracy was asked to not receive foreign aid and not to have a sanctuary outside of Nicaragua. The Sandinistas were left to comply with the democratization agreements to their will. And I'm going to end with the Zapoa agreements. In January 1988, no one had complied with the agreement signing Esquipulas. The guerrillas in Guatemala and El Salvador had initiated offensives while the Contra was obeying the ceasefire. And what are the lessons learned from this period? First, negotiating no matter what for the international community interested in ending a conflict, not paying attention to the details of the conflict. There needs to be a way to negotiate, even if there are no guarantees. that is going to be complied with. The negotiation of a crisis should have as a requirement not just the political will of those negotiating, but the minimal security conditions. The second lesson learned is the asymmetry in the negotiations and fragility of the agreements. There can only be negotiation when one of the contenders cannot crush the other. But that does not mean that they go to the negotiating table on equal terms. Almost always there are asymmetries. The negotiations that led to the disarmament of the resistance fighters, all the conditions and external factors from Esquipulas II discriminated, demanded, and forced La Contra to accept humiliating conditions. And number three, the similarity in the methods of negotiation during the Contra and now. In the time of La Contra, Daniel Ortega said that they would not talk with the clowns but with the owners of the circus. Something similar to what he said recently, that he was not going to talk to terrorists but with President Trump. In the 80s, the negotiation was not a test of good faith, but an obligation due to internal and external pressures. The same thing happens today, but they use the same methods, constant evasions to gain time, concessions, uh, small concessions and partial commitments, easy to breach when international witnesses leave and the dictatorship is strengthened. I'm going to say the conclusions very quickly. 40 years after the Sandinista revolution, the results cannot be more unfortunate. There are failures in all the aspirations and rights that the people of Nicaragua wanted to achieve while paying the highest cost. Death, misery, suffering, and above all, the reproduction of a model that became a dictatorship and has been transformed into a tyranny. Corruption, crimes, and abuses to the life of the Nicaraguan population to this day are crimes committed by the heirs of the revolution. Thousands of soldiers, officials, police, and paramilitaries, direct and indirect culprits of crimes against humanity, were not educated and indoctrinated by imperialism. They were educated and indoctrinated by the revolution. Many people think that the legacy of the revolution was the democratic spring that followed the loss of the Sandinista front in the 1989 elections. And I wonder, if there was not a bogged down war, a generalized crisis, and unprecedented international pressure, would they have accepted to a supervised election? Would they have handed over power to the democratically elected authorities of the people? My answer is no. The democracy that began in 1990 is not a legacy of the revolution. The anti-democratic revolutions never inherit power to the Democrats. It is an elementary principle of totalitarian doctrines. They appear to deliberate, but they continue to govern from below, with crimes like Ortega to the descendants of the revolution to sabotage that nascent democracy that they could not obtain through the votes. Commander Tomas Borge, leader of the Sandinista revolution, would tell Daniel Ortega years later that everything can happen here except the Sandinista front losing power. We can pay any price, whatever they say. The only thing we cannot lose is power. Let's do what we have to do. Finally, the democratic sprint was in spite of the anti-democratic revolution and due to the struggle of thousands of men and women in La Contra, in internal resistance and exile. From my perspective, democracy was the legacy of the Contra. Thank you very much.
Bueno, me alegro de ser,
Good afternoon. I'm glad that I'm the last one because I think everyone is now tired and they're not going to argue with me too much. But I just wanted to make a few comments before diving into the topic, which is peace and democracy. Peace and democracy of 79 at this stage of the party. I would like to start saying the following. I think it's impossible to understand the Sandinista revolution and what is happening now with Sandinismo if we do not understand that there were two different visions within Sandinismo. You had the vision of what they had lived and that they had been nursing for years and decades in some cases in the Cuban Revolution. And then there's a vision of those who had never left the country, those who had been revolting against Somoza. So I think that there was that difference. In my opinion, looking back and trying to understand the differences, I think it explains a lot. It does. In the sector of those who were being nursed by this Cuban model of revolution, I think they wanted to just reiterate the Cuban model. They were the ones that lived there and thought that that was the model that had to be adopted. And they thought that that was the way to do a revolution. There was the idea that Jacinto Suarez had, the idea that so-and-so had, I don't even know who else had, many other people who were living there for many years. But what we did in the revolution from here, and we never even left the country, and I think there are various people here, was that we never wanted one party, just one party, never. I was a student political leader in 73, 74, 75, and I was the most versed because I was one of the leaders. And something that I can never forget is that we were going to do a revolution and that it never occurred to me that that would be one political party. We were trying to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship, and then after the dictatorship, we were going to have freedom. And that was basically the end of it. That was the end of our conceptual development because, so let's not make any myths. You know, I had to look at who were the specialists in Marxism, but there were actually few who had actually read Marx. From the Sandinista front, we were a Sandinista front for action, not for debate, not for discussion. We had that enormous difference between the FLMN. That was a political party, Marxist, and they had a lot more education than we had. And I remember that my generation of student leaders, even when we saw all of the trends, the Marxism that we read was something like this thick. It was very brief. It was, you know, very, very brief, but we weren't reading any other types of books because they weren't allowed to be circulated. So that's where we were at. So for that generation, for the young generation of the 1970s, which I was a part of, the generation that actually involved itself in the student revolution and then was involved in the war. Those are the ones that in the 1970s would go out to the mountains and were clandestines and were dying. I don't think that that generation, with the little education that they had and little training, I don't think they were very, very Marxist. So it's very important to understand that why now there's these two different points of view of Sandinismo. Why are there these two visions? Because there's this internal fight against the front, which failed. Why? Because the fail of democracy within the front meant a failure of democracy in Nicaragua. I think we just have to keep that clear. So I just wanted to state that idea of having those two different visions. And then the other topic would be education. The education in the Sandinista front, you know, the student leadership obviously would study more. They would study more about politics, but then they went off to war. I just read a book by Humberto Ortega, and he was saying that this never even happened, that this was an invention. And Eric was like, well, I don't remember Humberto Ortega, but I did know Managua. I knew the student movements. I knew all of the movements that existed, and that was the Sandinista front that people saw. They didn't see the clandestine movement or the clandestine front. So it's these different perspectives that have to do with the generations, because there was a group in Havana that had been there for 5 or 7 years, and they were 20 years older than our generation. So our education pretty much went to that point. So I understand that the proletarian tendencies was what we were studying most. You know, pamphlets but, you know, at least we had pamphlets. I remember that in the GPP, I was part of that, and we almost never wrote anything, and we were given things to read, and I would go get the brochures from Prole, and then I would change a few things and then present them such as if they were GPP pamphlets, so that, you know, our group could study up a little bit more. So, you know, we have this vision of this Marxist movement and this communist movement, but no, it was a revolution that was very genuine, by a generation of young people who was carrying out this revolution together with their older counterparts who had had another experience and who had another vision. Now, on the other hand, I see young people here, and to those young people who see our defects, you know, I think that they look at the defects, but they avoid our virtues. This to brag about all of this. And I think that bragging is worse when power is absolute. So I think that new generations should reflect on that, so that they can listen and hear better. So like the women were saying, hear women, because we don't hear women. We need to hear mothers. They are the first ones that in the cities and in the societies knew that we were doing things wrong. But we weren't paying any attention to them. So avoid doing that. But you should also cultivate the virtue of rebellion, but also of irreverence. You should be irreverent. You should challenge ideas. You should challenge proposals. What Lester did with Daniel Ortega, you know, that's why dialogue has failed. But that's not true. That is being irreverent. We have to be able to destroy myths so that we can progress in a more solid and firm manner. So be irreverent. Kinser did that before the United Nations, right? In 1983, the United States, the Reagan administration denied that they were financing the Contra Revolution. That was in 1983. And I showed them the newspaper in the New York Times. And Mrs. Kilpatrick started to say Oh no, but it's that Sandino was democratic. Sandino was democratic, Kilpatrick said. But Sandinistas are Marxists, are communists. And so when she says that in the United Nations Security Council, and this gentleman was here as well, I asked somebody to go get me a book by Sergio Ramirez, and there was a specific quote of something Sandino had said about North American imperialism. And I said, well, you say that Sandino was democratic. I would like to show this to Mrs. Kilpatrick. What was Sandino thinking about you? What were his thoughts about you? And he would say, they're just like gang members. And I remember that the president of the UN Security Council, that we are talking about irreverence. We are talking about being irreverent, and we have to challenge things. We can't just take them. So now, peace and democracy. How important was peace and democracy in this period? In the afternoon, the ambassador said something that to follow peace and democracy, we can analyze all of these 40 years in 1980, 1979, 1986. Peace was impossible. The Reagan administration didn't want it, and the Sandinista movement did not want it either. That's the truth. We came to power, and immediately we started to see how we can have revolution in El Salvador, in Guatemala. It was this internationalism, and we started to promote revolution everywhere. And then after it started as an idealism, which Luis was talking about, we started to do it because it was convenient in order to counterweight the war, that contra-revolutionary war. That was when we started to support that. And so we had this war in El Salvador, which was kind of a counterweight to everything that the American administration was doing. So I am convinced that the Reagan administration did not want peace, and we were not mature enough to want peace. And I'm saying this because this topic of democracy in our sector was something that was quite strange. I don't know what it meant in the United States. But in our lexicon, it didn't seem like it was leading to anything. What was proposed? Well, the same thing that happened in El Salvador, the revolution, the same thing that was happening in the Soviet Union, the same thing happened with democracy. And then with the negotiations between the Nicaraguan government and the U.S. government, which was done in Mexico, there were 10 sessions of negotiations during 10 months. And I was the head of the delegation of Nicaragua with Joaquin Cuadra and other people, and Mr. Lopez was also there, actually. We began negotiating. But the truth is that it never had a future. From the very beginning, it didn't have a future. There were no conditions for peace. On either side, there was the idea that it was going to continue being militant. So even in the 1984 elections, I think they were elections that they thought could help get rid of the war, but that was a complete mistake. On the contrary, the war grew after the 1984 elections. That was the peak of the war. which was in 1985, which we see the largest number of deaths and the largest amount of combat. It wasn't until 1986, more or less, when everyone was tired of the war. Everyone was tired of the war. When all of the actors, I think that the resistance was tired of 4 or 5 years of combat. The Sandinistas were also tired. The U.S. government was tired because they had to keep finding aid for the Contra-Revolution, which was getting more and more difficult. And now remember that 500 Congress members from the United States have voted for Daniel Ortega, who is even Bernie Sanders, who is a leftist, politician. Back then, it was Democrats versus the Republicans. But Reagan was trying to find the money to even get one vote of those 500. In 1983, he had to accept publicly, during that meeting that I had with Mrs. Kilpatrick, that he was doing this, he was finding the financing illegally, and that they wanted to have him held accountable. And then in 1987 or 88, I think it was 87, we see that Central American governments also unite because they're also tired of the war. And even though Reagan doesn't like it, he doesn't like the idea very much, he is still not completely against it. And so I think it was that exhaustion that allowed a more real negotiation with the resistance. So between the resistance and the Sandinista government. So I guess time has run out. So democracy, I don't think, had a greater role in the banner that the U.S. was waving or the revolution was waving. And Sandinismo was quite strong until the 1990 when they were defeated in the elections. So we see that that's when the conversation starts in the Sandinista camp, and that's when they started to restructure the Sandinista movement, and they began their internal battle. So it ended with the exit of MRS in 1995, and then that fight continued after that exit by MRS within the Sandinista front. We saw that they imposed the need for internal elections, that was very necessary for the Sandinista front. There was competition, and in the first competition, Vilma Noyen participated. In the second, I did, along with Alejandro. And in the third, we proposed Arteli Vite, and he was the one that was going against Daniel Ortega. And that's when Daniel Ortega won the elections. So in 2005, it was decided to take out Irte Bolite, to take me out, and to proclaim somebody as the candidate. So democracy in 2005 dies within the Sandinista movement. So it died after. And this was a consequence of the pact that they made in 1988 with Aleman, which was a pact with mobsters. This was a pact that was done I mean, I am convinced that it was done with thugs, and that's what caused democracy to just basically go to hell. You know, they were controlling the army, they were controlling the police. So, democracy today, again, is the central topic in Nicaragua. It is the main topic in Nicaragua. And I think that it is the topic that, in some way, should be reflected upon seriously. I think that the April Revolution last year was a surprise for Daniel Ortega. It was a surprise for everyone. We didn't know what was going to happen. But they thought that, we were going to prepare ourselves for another 10 years of a prolonged social resistance. But fortunately, the new generation came up and did this uprising. And that's where we have now all participated, so that we can have a democratic and tolerant society in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Muy bien, gracias. Adelante. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left, which means we have to be out here at 6:05. So we'll take a round of questions. Ningún comentario, pregunta, tiene que ser corte con el tiempo, ¿ok? Y luego va a ser 4 minutos para que contesten. Okay, please.
Sí, a mí me parece que necesario.
Well, I had a comment and not necessarily a question, but I think it's important to understand the fight of young people. I think they have to consider everything that Victor Hugo has said, that in a certain way it is true.
Because when the dictatorship was removed, it wasn't because of the working class or the peasant movement. It was a social movement, mainly from the youth. And then they tried to say that it was a classist revolution. Those are lies. It wasn't like that. And I go back to the Somocista fight, going back to 1944. It was a revolution born from the universities, and I think one of the dangers that this movement can go through today is that there is a co-opt of a political leadership that wants to take that away from the new generations. That's my point. Carlos? Two concrete questions for Donald. The elections in 1984. How was that debated inside the Contra and the Reagan administration? I know the Sandinista version. Elections that weren't completely competitive or transparent, but there was a space. In the Junta de Poder, we know Don Arturo Cruz version that they never reached an agreement. There was a veto and there was pressure. My question is, was there any pressure to impose the military option in front of the possibility that they had in 1984, and in the 1990 elections, the Contra forms behind the PNP or the PLN? Why can they be a lasting force? There's a question back there. Good afternoon, my name is Gerardine Milke, but everyone knows me as Jerry. I was in Nicaragua a few weeks ago talking to everyone, people from the government, and they are saying that there could be early elections, but government people told me that if they happened, Daniel Ortega would win again, due to the simple fact that the elections require a great organization, and people don't know it. They need 6 chancellors at each position, and they don't have enough political structure to counteract all the force the Sandinista have, and there's no defined candidate. They're playing with 3 or 4 names, but nothing is defined. And I asked, and they said that it's not possible for there to be early elections. And someone from the Department of State told me that the best thing you could expect would be for Daniel Ortega not to run again in 2021, because that's a possibility too. So I would like to ask Victor Hugo Tinoco if, knowing Daniel Ortega personally, do you think he will run again in 2021? He's vetoed by the U.S., but my name is Felix Jimenez. I'm a history major in Boston College. My question is more historical but related to the present. A historical example. In April of 1985, the New York Times published an urgent message to the Europeans in Congress, support the Nicaraguan resistance. And they were Europeans. We haven't talked a lot about Europe, and I want to know the roles played by other countries besides the US in the peace processes, and what role can Europe play nowadays? What role could they have? They would have a less problematic role than Trump. So, you both have 2 minutes to answer. Time runs out. Carlos Fernando, effectively in 1984, they didn't have any relevance inside the resistance because we knew, or we thought at least, that it was a formal coverage of the Sandinista front, and the solution wasn't going to be through that space. The solution would come from a popular movement. There was always a lot of confusion. While the US promoted and financed a contentious war, the people in Nicaragua that had joined the fight fought for another thing. They fought for a true toppling of the Sandinista movement. So there wasn't a line like the one the Sandinista had. They always had well-defined political, military lines that were very disciplined. But the gringos had different vision between them. The Contra had different visions, and there was no response. After 1990, why didn't it prosper? Well, I've read a little bit about the exile in various countries. In Spain, the Republicans that fought and then went out, and the great communist leaders from Spain, and the anarchists that almost died in Spain. When the democracy came around, no one took them into account. It was something completely different. It was Felipe González, the PSOE, and a new reality. And that happened a little bit in Nicaragua. The new political reality after the triumph wasn't made up of those who fought. The resistance didn't make up the political party. They didn't have a political education. Many commanders were co-opted, and other were murdered. Many of them were murdered. Many of the main leaders were assassinated, Franklin and those people. So these people were not ready. They never achieved anything. We need time. Just the Europe thing. Just one thing to say about Europe. Europe, like many Latin Americans, sympathized with the resistance, but they weren't able to say it publicly. When I went to Mexico, a great Mexican leader told me, the only ones that can overthrow the Sandinistas are the North Americans, and we are going to be very happy when that happens, but we are going to be the first one to condemn them. And don't say that, because we won't let you come to our country again. So, well, in terms of the question of if Ortega will win the elections, I think that the first person that does not believe that is Daniel Ortega. If Daniel Ortega would believe that, he would do that quickly. Second, I want to say something very clearly. In my opinion, if there are no early elections for 2020, there won't be elections in 2021. It's a myth believing that if Ortega doesn't change from this year to the next, it's going to change for 2021. There aren't going to be any free elections in 2021. Let's be clear on that. There are not going to be any free elections in 2021 if we don't force him to have early free elections as soon as possible, at least next year. So if he wins the battle of not having early elections, we are going to be in the same situation, and we're going to go back to have the ghost of violence in Nicaragua, and it's not very difficult for it to be born again. For the history of Nicaragua, the amount of weapons there are, and I think it's key to force Ortega to have early elections. Excellent. Great. We are done.